Hi, I'm Kelly DiMartino with the City of Fort Collins. Today we're having a conversation about resourcing our future. This is a conversation that we're having in the community about the future of Fort Collins. And there are 4 specific areas that we're really talking about some pressing needs. One of those areas is police services, another is fire, another is parks and recreation, and also street maintenance. Today we're fortunate to have joining us 2 individuals from police services to provide some context about the needs of that organization. First, we have Police Chief Dennis Harrison. Dennis, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for asking.
And Sergeant Mike Tromley. Mike, thanks for being here.
Morning, Kelly. Thank you.
Dennis, I'm going to ask you to start us off by just talking a little bit about Police Services Agency. Talk a little bit about kind of how large the organization is right now, the services you provide, and what you've seen in terms of trends over the past 5 years.
Well, currently we have about 172 police officers, sworn officers. That's from me to the newest officer that's there. We have 88 civilian staff, so roughly 260 people that make up the entirety of the department. Over the last 5 years, like most other city departments, we have held very, very static in the amount of people that we have. And so that number rose with the Southwest annexation with kind of restricted funding that had to go for people to work in that area. The trend we're seeing is that our crime, thankfully, it's a very safe community. Our crime levels and our call load are staying within a few percentage points of being pretty static, as they've been for many years. But the growth continues, and our calls for service and the expectations of our community continue to increase, and we have found ourselves having to pull out of more hands-on neighborhood long-term problem solvings and issues like that than what we're really comfortable with. We've abolished several different units over the years to be able to continue to provide direct service to the public, and that's becoming troubling.
Mike, you're actually kind of out on the street a little bit and have been over the past few years. Tell us a little bit about what, as Chief talks about some of the things that are troubling or the trends, talk a little bit about what type of calls you guys go on most frequently. And, for those of us who just say, hey, Fort Collins really does feel like a safe place, what's kind of a typical day like for you?
Well, my day is a little bit different from some other sergeants. I'm in charge of our traffic enforcement unit. So I deal usually with the number one concern of the citizens, which is traffic throughout the city. I can tell you for our days, it varies, and the priorities vary based on the day. One of the interesting things that we always talk about is to any given person, there's one topic that's going to be more important. Maybe it's a school zone enforcement or a neighborhood enforcement. What we try to do, though, is we have to satisfy items A through G rather than just focusing on that one item. So one of the points that we try to make is, on any given day, these are all priorities to us. So what we're going to do to respond to that is going to vary based on the prioritization of the day and the concerns. Beyond that area, for our patrol officers and our patrol sergeants, a typical day, it varies. Nighttime, obviously, a lot of our patrol work centers around disturbances and, I'll say just keeping the peace type issues. Daytime, a lot of the issues obviously revolve around that as well. But they're also going to involve things such as more basic investigations, issues that have come up over the night. That's when most of the people are available to call and ask questions of the police, ask us to help solve a long, ongoing problem or something like that. So obviously between day and night, the call types vary. Nighttime is probably more responsive and reactive, whereas daytime is generally a little bit more proactive.
So I understand that there are some kind of goals that we would have in terms of how much time we spend versus in responding to the amount of time that officers have to do that proactive work. Where does our police services stack up in terms of how much time we're spending on reactive versus proactive, and are we at the right balance?
Well, it's a good question, and actually the answer is no, we're not. In 2007, we commissioned the city and the police department commissioned a study by the Police Executive Research Forum. And that's a think tank C3 group out of Washington, D.C. that went through a competitive process, and they do this all over the country. And they looked at the amount of staffing we have, and they talked to the neighborhoods. They had focus groups to discuss, what do you want out of your police department? And our goal is actually to have 40% of an officer's time spent on just handling calls, 40% of their time spent on are having free time, freed up so that they can deal with neighborhood issues, business issues, those kinds of more hands-on things that take longer periods of time, because they usually take research, they take involvement, they take focus. They don't just go out. Our focus is not to just go out and enforce. A lot of times that doesn't solve the community need and the community issue. So currently, if you look at where we are, we're probably maybe, dependent on the month, 15-20% availability time for that type of issue. And key to that question is the fact that that doesn't come in a lump sum of time. You know, when we look at an officer's time over the course of a shift, a 10-hour day, they may have an hour available, they may have 2 hours available, but it comes in snippets of time. Because if they have that length of time strung together, then this is a community where our patrol force also carries a number of investigations. We were talking earlier about burglaries in neighborhoods, and one of the things, we will have a patrol officer that investigates burglaries in their own neighborhood, not where they live, but in the neighborhood that they police, because they know the people and all that. That's unusual. Most places you don't carry cases from the street because you don't have that time availability. You asked earlier also about, kind of an average, you asked Mike about an average time and what calls we're handling. One of the examples is just last night, we had a situation that started out as a bit of a confrontation, a boyfriend-girlfriend or ex-girlfriend type call down here in District 1 that ended up going out to West Elizabeth, where they drove by and fired off 5 or 6 shots at a subject. That's turning out, we're going to discuss charging for second-degree murder. That starts off at a very low end, and we never know where that's going to go. The point for saying that isn't to say that this is a commonplace thing. It's becoming more commonplace. But as we went to take the people into custody, we literally had to call the sheriff's office, and they came over and added staffing to be able to, in the assistance, to do a felony stop, so we could safely make that stop without having to react in a way that was troublesome or overreact or run that risk, because we had the right amount of people, but we're involving other agencies to do it. If they were not available at that time, it could have been a different outcome. So
I think that raises a really good, or maybe another question for me. How do we disperse the people that we have available? And you mentioned different neighborhoods. I mean, are you all kind of assigned to, hey, here's my part of town that I'm responsible for? How many people are out and about at any given time? Because that, it sounds like, hey, we have a fair amount of officers, but when you think about 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, spread out, it's maybe not quite as much as it originally would seem.
Let me let Mike talk in just a second about what they see in the traffic and their philosophy, because it is trying to keep more people in given areas. We have a set number of beats or districts where we have officers, and we try to have a couple of officers in that district at any given time, dependent on proportional staffing and calls for service and all that, so that they can handle them quickly, any call that comes in quickly, or at least efficiently. That doesn't always work out. I think when you look across the face of it, we have, it's 5 or 6 that are actually set districts, and then they have some that will overlap, and we have those cars. But let's talk about Sunday morning at midnight shift or something. You can have on average somewhere between 6 and 9 people for the whole city. That's it. Wednesday evenings, you might have 11 or 12. Friday and Saturday night, between pocketed periods of time from 6, 8, 9 on forward to 2 or 3 in the morning, you will have somewhere around, you probably have 15, maybe a few more. But the reality of that is, come 3 o'clock, you're back down to having 6, 9, 8, whatever we have staffed it that day. But on average, we try to staff a minimum of 9 in the entirety of the city. We don't always make that. As you well know, our overtime last year, we paid $1.7 million in $1.7 million roughly in overtime, and a great percentage of that was just to make sure we have minimum representation out there. And it's pretty labor intensive, but it's also statistically driven as to when we know our peak times are. But Mike, talk a little bit about how you deploy the traffic unit and how many people are really in it.
One of the interesting things I see in my position is kind of overcoming the perception of how many officers are actually out there versus reality. And we can always get the job done. We're always going to be able to get out and handle the emergencies we need to handle. It's just a question of, aside from those emergencies, what are the opportunity costs? If I handle this problem, what am I giving up and not getting to? We have 7 patrol districts in the city. I have 5 traffic officers. And that's 5 guys for the entire city. So obviously I don't have enough to staff even every district. Now what we do is there are certainly assigned areas within the city that they work, but at the same time a lot of those are going to take more than 1 officer to work. So one day I may have 3 officers working a problem in a school zone or something like that. That's important and we need to work that. But at the same time when those 3 officers are there, they're not elsewhere in the city. And again, it's just a matter of what do we want to focus on today. So I do the best we can as far as, okay, today this is the priority, but it may not be the priority for another 10 days after that because we're going to go work on this. Often when I take calls from people, I say, well, how many officers do you think we have? And even in the traffic unit, people assume I have 25 or 30 traffic officers out working. When I tell them I have 5 officers that cover 1,800 miles of roadway, that's 350 miles per officer. It's difficult to be everywhere. We want to be everywhere, but trying to sometimes just conveying that is enough to, I think, really open people's eyes. One of the other things that we talk about, last year was a tragic year for fatal traffic accidents. We had 11. My accident reconstruction team, of which all my traffic officers are members, actually went out on 16 call-outs last year. When we go out on those accident reconstructions, all the members of the traffic unit also make up that reconstruction and investigation team. We essentially don't have a traffic unit for several days following those crashes. Again, that's frankly more important to investigate those fatal accidents, but there's always that opportunity cost of what are we giving up by using that.
So you're always prioritizing it, emergency, obviously. I
Right.
mean, that's going to be your first priority. And I'm not hearing you say, hey, we can't cover emergency, but there's this whole other layer of important things that you're stretched too thin to be able to cover. Is
Right.
that adequate?
Well, and as we were talking before, is that the emergency, yes, we'll get there. And our emergency response time still is in an acceptable area. It's in the 3-minute range. And comparative to the region, that's okay. But you look at the number of truly emergent calls that we handle compared to the level 2s and level 3s, to where as they step down in importance and in priority, people wait much, much longer. Party calls and things like that, it's not unheard of on busy Friday, Saturday nights or something for people to wait, even with our program of where we've done some changing to do callbacks and things like that. It's a great program and it's working. But if we have to go out to one, it can be an hour to 2 hours readily on some nights that people will wait. So those are the areas where those visible signs of disorder become a real problem for us to handle, to know what to do and what priority comes up. Those quality of life issues impact every citizen in this community, and we hear it and we know it. It's just that's where the real availability and the rub comes.
Right, absolutely. I want to go back to something, actually, I heard both of you say, first overtime, and then I want to go back to the perception of that we have more officers than what we maybe do. Let's start with this overtime. We're talking about, is the city using its resources that we have most effectively, right? Are we using resources effectively? And I think both of these are areas where that comes up. Overtime. Is that the best way to be spending money on overtime? Is there a better way? And why are we spending so much money on overtime? So let's start with that, and then we'll get to those police cars that we see all over town.
Okay. We think that it is a misnomer that is out there, and we had this debate and discussion recently, even with the council, about you spent this much money in overtime, why don't you just take that money that you would spend in overtime and hire 2 or 3 police officers, and then we'll get rid of the overtime. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. A vast majority of the overtime is for showing up for shifts to make sure we have a minimum standard, but it's also for holding over investigating calls, investigating cases, and doing things like that. So when we're using that kind of overtime, that won't go away even if we have more officers. I mean, we will probably be able to cut in that area if we had what we've agreed upon to be somewhat sufficient staffing. We could probably cut 30–40% of that. But there's other overtime that goes into that. When you look at the big picture, the overtime for working like a July 4th, a city event, we can't staff the street and staff the major events like that. Now, there's not many of those during the year, But that overtime won't go away. There are the compensation issues of when they have to work. It's a 24/7 business, so they have to work on holidays, the Christmases, New Year's, all the things when other city staff and other people just aren't working. We pay for that by federal regulation. It's not about we're just being benevolent. We have to pay for those types of things too. So the overtime isn't going to go away. Officers still go to court. Officers still have to be on midnight shift and come in during the day for certain things. Now, we can adjust that with training, we can do those kind of things, but to cut overtime. And we watch it very, very carefully.
What is that process? I mean, if you mentioned an accident scene, I assume that's one of those places where they wouldn't just go home when their shift ends, they may have to stay. So what is the process of authorizing or deciding how long someone stays and when we can let them go and not be paying additional overtime?
It's obviously based on need most of the time. I don't think any police officer signs up knowing that at 5 o'clock when the bell rings that they go home. You stay until we've either got the work done or somebody else can take over that work. It's not uncommon on a weekend night. Our swing shift goes home at 2:30. It's not uncommon sometimes to have to stay till 4 in the morning because we're dealing with bar disturbances, fights. And we don't stay or hold those officers longer than needed, but we do hold them long enough to make sure that we have enough staffing on the street. Another example, when we talk about the accidents, and again, remember, when I talk about accidents that I'm investigating, I'm talking about the major felony level accidents, fatal, something like that. If we have 12 officers out on a day shift, it takes about 12 officers just to work that accident. When you start thinking about the actual investigation, interviewing witnesses, going to the hospital to get records, closing off the roadway, we would literally deplete every officer in the city just to be on that one scene, and that's not a good way to do business. Our accident reconstruction team is actually an on-call team. It's comprised of detectives, officers from patrol, officers really from all over the organization, and they're on an on-call basis. Now, on any given time, some of those officers are going to be working. The other half are probably going to be on overtime. But we need to bring those people in and apply them to that problem, and that requires the use of overtime. But that's probably more a tactical use of that overtime that we get more bang for the buck, if you will, than if we just had those people around.
Right. So again, there may be some savings if we have additional officers, but we're never going to eliminate overtime. It's the nature of your business.
Right.
Okay. Take-home car policy. Let's talk a little bit about that. Again, it feels like perhaps we have more officers than we do because you're pretty visible. Talk about how or why we do that as a department. What's the value of the take-home car policy, and how does it work?
Well, I think that Mike was saying about the perception of how many people we have out there. That's the idea. The reality that the take-home car plan has been in place about 25, 26 years. And it started when the organization was much, much smaller. And the whole idea in it was to be a force multiplier, that there is that quote-unquote halo effect. When you're driving down the road, usually when you see a police officer, you don't speed up or you don't decide to run the red light. And that's a limited, it's a limited benefit situation. But the bottom line is, if we can be more visible in the neighborhoods like they take at home, there's police cars parked in front of houses. The average criminal isn't going to know whether that's someone sleeping there in the middle of the night or the officer's there on a call, depending on what's there. That presence is incredibly important to us because people see it and there's a deterrent. The fact of it is that our officers who take those cars home, we have a mileage limitation of how far they can leave the community with them. This last year we changed the plan. We charge the officer for the ability to take that car to and from work. They pay a fee, and it's based on how far out they live, and nobody can take a vehicle home beyond a 15-mile radius figured from College and Mulberry, which has been set that way for many, many years. So we have many officers who live beyond that particular mileage limitation. They park the car at the station. That's where it sits. The benefit to the citizen, first of all, within the past 6 months, we've had a couple of different calls that it was off-duty officers who made the arrest. They were headed home and saw it. The officer must take enforcement action if they see it, if they're driving our car, and they do. We get lots of, if you will, free policing simply because they are in the community and they're available for it. We don't expect them to do certain types of calls just because they're out there driving to and from. But the number of DUIs we've stopped and things like that, it continues. So the benefit to the community also is a capital expenditure benefit. Most regular fleet plans, you have to change all of the cars and buy new every 3-4 years because of the use on a 24-hour basis. We hold our cars probably in the realm of 7-8 years. So that capital expenditure is not there. And they get more out of it. We can drive them longer, their service costs are lower, so the actual benefit to the citizen in a cost factor plus in an extra policing factor is pretty obvious.
Great. And my understanding is that also for some of these special units, right, whether you're talking about traffic or some of our other units that might be called out on a special situation, that it helps with our response times as well in some of those emergency situations. Is that true?
Oh, certainly. From the time we get called out, whether it's 2 in the morning or noon on a work day, we generally have our whole team on scene with our equipment, and we're taking over that scene investigating within about 20 minutes. If we didn't have that ability, it's twofold actually. One, I'd have to wait for officers to drive to the station. And again, they're not driving lights and siren, they're driving with traffic laws and everything else. Get their equipment, find equipment, stock the car with the equipment they need to handle that call, then drive back to the scene. Whether it's a SWAT call, a fatal accident investigation, time is critical. That first hour is really important. We're losing evidence. We're not controlling a scene we need to control. And I can't tell you how valuable it is at 2 in the morning to be 20 minutes to a scene with all the gear we need, everything ready to go, and ready to work. So there, from my perspective, it's invaluable.
Right. You know, as we think about this looking forward in our community, I think one of the challenges we have, particularly in the area of police services, is that it does seem like a very safe community to people, and that's a good thing. We like that. I would like to hear just from both of you, how long have both of you been with the department?
I've been with Fort Collins for 10 years and law enforcement for 16 now.
Okay. And Chief?
I've been here, I'm in my 14th year as the chief and my 37th year in law enforcement.
So I'd just be curious from both of your perspectives, I mean, what are some of the proactive things or the things that Fort Collins Police Services has done in the past that has been really effective, that have gotten us to this point? And then what are the things as you look forward that you say, here's the stuff that is kind of a red flag for us that we're worried about?
My honest answer, and it's going to sound funny, but it's not funny in a way that's not true. But
we like funny police officers.
It truly is the quality of the people that we have. And I know that's easy to refer to, but the fact that everyone takes ownership. It's not, hey, that's not my problem, I'll pass that to somebody else. We see an issue and we deal with it, and the officers truly care about what they're doing. We talk about accident investigation. My whole team was up handling 2 fatals back-to-back with a 2-hour separation for 36 hours. At the end of that 36 hours, they had as good an attitude as when they started. And how do you encapsulate that? But it's that extra piece that everybody puts into this agency, that they truly care, that frankly I think carries us. That it's an intangible, but it's hard to really quantify. It's immensely effective.
And I really appreciate that because that's very well said, so I don't have to say as much. It is the people, and it is their commitment to what they want to do in police work for this community. We talked before, the District 1 outreach facility that we have. You know, in years gone by, that was staffed with about 16 people, something in that realm. Well, it's at 6 now. And we've taken those people out to do reactive work calls for service. When it first came in, they did walking patrols of the Buckingham neighborhood. They did walking patrols in Alta Vista. They'd walked Old Town in a much bigger presence way, and knowing the people and dealing with the issues in a long-term base. It isn't walk up and give someone a ticket and say, stop that. It is, let's analyze and see what the problem is. In years gone by, we had the Special Enforcement Unit that did long-term problem-solving issues, high level in the neighborhoods. They were focused on those kinds of things. We disbanded the unit because we needed them for calls for service out there. The big thing about this community and the policing they get is the fact that, just like Mike said, I've never been as impressed with an agency as the officers here who really, really want to handle the problems. We believe in community policing. That means getting out there and looking beyond just enforcement, just the base. Get out there and look at what the problems are. Partner with the neighbors. We don't want to be an occupying force. our request for what we want and how we figure staffing is less than the regional averages, and will always be less than the regional averages if we stay in front of it, if we can stay in front of it. So there are very, very few officers and CSOs and civilian staff that are in this community or in this police department that don't have 2 or 3 different ancillary jobs. Like he speaks of, the traffic unit's primary, but the crash team's there. Some of them are in SWAT. Some of them are negotiators. You know, all of our people have probably 2 or 3 hats they wear, and that's one of the key things this community has received before Dennis Harrison. That, you know, that started. We've improved on it, but they've always had that, and it keeps the cops really involved, and not as an occupying force. As I said earlier, this is rare that you have patrol officers still carrying cases at this day and age with the time commitments we have. But the benefit to the citizen is much better police officers. They understand evidence collection better. They understand what it takes to get a case all the way through court, victim services, what the impact on the community is. They're much more plugged in. They're much more receptive to what's happening. I was very proud of the agency I came from, and I grew up in it. But I've never been more impressed with a group of men and women that put what they have day in, day out to this community with a focus on the community. They enjoy it, and they get a good time out of it. But you know, it's a pretty special group of people, and we don't want to lose that. Our standards are high. We don't just hire anybody, and you know, we have that luxury still.
Which I think this community expects, a high quality in all of our services, and certainly in our police services. So as we wrap up our conversation today, I want to bring this back to the, again, looking forward and the resourcing our future conversation. Just in quick sound bites. We're talking about an additional $4.6 million a year for police services that is needed. The majority of that cost would go for additional officers and support staff, is my understanding.
The bulk of it is 33 police officers, 20 in patrol, 13 in detectives, 5 more dispatchers, and the remainder being civilian staff that we can use efficiently to support that and to support the total mission.
And again, I think what we've heard from both of you is that's not a police officer on every corner model, but it is helping with what's becoming an increasingly stretched thin department in terms of being able to respond to needs.
And to tell you, if we were to receive those numbers that Perf said, we would still be the next to the bottom in ratio of officers per thousand in the region. We would go to about 1.48, 1.5 per thousand instead of the 1.2 we're at. The other agencies in the region are all higher than that, and we're not going to go to the top of the list.
That's not the goal.
No, never was.
Right. All right. Well, as we wrap up, Mike, thank you for being here. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, since you put me on the spot, no, I think we've covered it. Just to dovetail on what the chief was saying, this has never been, I don't think, about being the most officers in a city or anything like that. It's about alleviating some of those opportunity costs we just talked about. Yeah. Maybe with a few extra people here or there strategically applied, obviously. But when we talk about, again, my focus is traffic, but maybe I can work that school zone and that neighborhood at the same time instead of just having to jump from one to the other. You know, I don't know if that kind of brings it home for folks or not, but that's really what we're talking about here.
All right, great. Thank you for being here. Chief, any final thoughts?
The only one that I'd like to add is that I'm not here to convince anybody what they should do with the resourcing our future issue. This is about the communication with the citizen out there. You get something out of this, and I want you to understand that we're here as a resource 24 hours a day. It isn't, as Mike said, about growing the department artificially or doing something like that. It really is about the service we provide to you, the service that when we can be there, and how efficiently and effectively. So people have choices to make, but we're on this role that we see it slipping away, and that does concern me. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here.
All right, well, thank you both for joining us. For more information on the choices we're facing, please go to fcgov.com/resourcingourfuture. Thanks for joining us.